European leaders have scheduled what's being called a once-in-a-generation emergency national security summit as the Trump administration tees up peace talks with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. But Ukrainian President Zelenskyy has said he would not sign any deal that was reached without Ukrainian input. And so far, he has not received an invitation to those peace talks. Despite that, the U.S. delegation is moving forward. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in Saudi Arabia today ahead of those expected talks to start tomorrow. Joining me now to discuss what's in store for those peace talks in the emergency European summit happening today in Paris is the Hill's White House reporter, Brett Samuels. Brett, it's always great to see you. Let's start with this summit in Paris with European leaders. This is clearly a response to Trump's friendlier tone towards Russian President Vladimir Putin after Trump took part in a phone call with Putin last week and discussed ending the war in Ukraine. What are European leaders concerned about, and what are they expected to discuss at this summit?
Yeah, Julia, I think European leaders for this meeting, I think the focus is on kind of looking forward and maybe sort of coming to terms with the reality that the United States under President Trump is not going to be in lockstep with Europe, particularly on the issue of the conflict in Ukraine, like we saw with the Biden administration. So certainly, I think this summit is a chance for European leaders to kind of plan for that new reality and sort of present a unified front of their own moving forward.
So Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy warned NATO allies over the weekend that Putin may be gearing up for a larger war. He said Russian troops gathering for training exercises in Belarus, similar to the exercises that preceded the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and even went as far as to say this.
All I've got from intelligence, and it's I think, to my mind, that he's preparing the war against NATO countries next year. And I think so. The same way what it was in 2022. So they can go forward to Ukraine, or they will go to Poland or to Baltic.
So what's been the reaction from the Trump administration? Are officials concerned at all about this heading into the peace talks with Russia this week?
Yeah, Julia, I think the Trump administration is sort of staying the course as far as they're concerned. They want this war to end in Ukraine. They've made clear that that's their priority, and they view talks with Russia here as sort of a necessary component of getting that done. And obviously, that's a shift from what we saw with the Biden administration, where what we heard from President Zelenskyy was a key part of their argument that, an attack on Ukraine could be the first step in a wider attack on NATO allies. So again, certainly a shift in tone and sort of rhetoric from administration to administration.
I want to focus more on those peace talks. Secretary Rubio is in Saudi Arabia today, along with National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. They're set to meet with senior Russian officials starting tomorrow on Tuesday. Republicans in Congress seem to be behind the president's efforts for peace. Congressman Mark Wayne Mullen saying over the weekend that people need to, quote, trust the process. Brett, what is that process, and what is the Trump administration's goals with these talks ultimately?
Yeah, I think, certainly when we hear Senator Mullins talk about trusting the process, I think that's sort of trying to calm any nerves about the fact that they're meeting with Russian officials. Ukrainian officials aren't going to be present for these talks. But I think the goal here is, these initial talks between Trump administration officials and Russian officials, their counterparts. I think the initial goal here is to sort of lay the foundation for what peace negotiations could look like, and possibly lay the foundation for a meeting in the coming weeks or months between President Trump and President Putin of Russia, which President Trump hinted at that those could take place in Saudi Arabia in the not too distant future.
Sticking with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State over the weekend defended Vice President J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, Germany on Friday, in which Vance accused European officials of censoring speech they disagreed with. Of course, those comments from Vance drew criticism from European officials. Rubio responded on CBS's Face the Nation on Sunday saying, quote, why would our allies or anybody be irritated by free speech and giving someone their opinion? Brett, how much of a wedge has Vance's speech actually caused between the U.S. and its allies?
Yeah, Julie, I don't know if it's caused a huge wedge yet, but it certainly, I think, caught some European leaders off guard. And it was sort of this broadside that Vance went over to Europe and in his first international appearance was sort of scolding Europe essentially and attacking them for these laws that he alleged were infringing on free speech. And he claimed were marginalizing more populist or fringe political groups. So certainly, I think it's sort of one piece of a larger puzzle we're seeing here, where the Trump administration is really making this very sort of drastic shift in foreign policy from the Biden administration. And this is something European officials are going to have to quickly adapt to.
Like we said, Rubio is in Saudi Arabia for those peace talks, but it comes after he visited Tel Aviv over the weekend, meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu said on Sunday that he and Trump are united in their strategy for Gaza's future, and part of that future seems to be eliminating Hamas. Here's Secretary Rubio over the weekend.
The president's been very clear. Hamas cannot continue as a military or government force. And frankly, as long as it stands as a force that can govern, or as a force that can administer, or as a force that can threaten by use of violence, peace becomes impossible. They must be eliminated. It must be eradicated.
Of course, this all comes as President Trump has repeatedly said he plans for the United States to, quote, take over the Gaza Strip and displace more than 2 million Palestinians. What's the status on that goal, and has there been any additional reaction to it lately?
Yeah, Julie, I think that goal is still very much a work in progress. It's something that I think it's fair to say is ambitious of the Trump administration. We saw, last week the King of Jordan visited, and after that visit with President Trump, put out a statement making clear that Jordan would not support the displacement of Palestinians. So I think the next thing that we're watching for is, whether Arab nations like Egypt and Jordan, Saudi Arabia sort of put forward their own proposal to sort of counter Trump's proposal. But, I think Secretary of State Rubio and others have made clear that Trump is serious when he talks about the U.S. taking over Gaza. So I don't think that's a proposal that is going anywhere anytime soon.
The Hill's White House reporter Brett Samuels, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Julia.
Across the U.S., federal courts are being swarmed with lawsuits fighting against President Trump's executive actions. As of now, more than 70 have been filed, with 30 focused directly on billionaire Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency and the president's freezing of federal funding. Now, the Trump administration is making its first appeal to the Supreme Court in an effort to greenlight the firing of the head of a federal agency designed to protect whistleblowers. Joining me now is the Hill's courts and legal reporter, Zach Schonfeld. Zach, Hampton Dellinger has been reinstated after a lower court ruling, with the Trump administration now asking the Supreme Court to overturn the order. If and when could we see the justices take this up?
Hey, Julia, we could see the court act very quickly here because this case has come to the Supreme Court on its emergency docket. So this is not following the normal trajectory that we see most cases take. Rather, what the Justice Department is doing here is asking the justices to step in to issue immediate relief to overturn effectively that Saturday night ruling from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that reinstates Hampton Dellinger to the position of U.S. Special Counsel. Now, this case hasn't officially made it onto the Supreme Court's docket. This came in on Sunday. Today is, of course, a federal holiday, so we don't expect to see the court set a briefing schedule until at least when they get back to normal operations tomorrow on Tuesday. But once they do, we know from seeing how they've handled emergency applications in the past, you'd expect this to be handled in a matter of days, not weeks or months.
Zach, while this case only centers around one federal employee, could any ruling by the Supreme Court have a wide-ranging effect on the powers the Trump administration has on its move to fire hundreds of thousands of federal workers?
Potentially. There are now 5 pending lawsuits that have been challenging Donald Trump's firings of various independent agency heads and members of government commissions across the executive branch. And collectively, those 5 lawsuits could tee up the Supreme Court to overturn a 90-year-old precedent that has made legal many of these for-cause removal protections. And so the Trump administration is really giving a lot of vehicles here for potentially the Supreme Court to take a look at that precedent. Now, you also mentioned the fact that, Trump is not only firing these heads and leaders of these agencies, but also carrying out these mass firings of the civil service across many different federal agencies. There's a whole nother set of lawsuits over that are being handled a little bit differently since those people aren't so senior and have just a little bit of different requirements and laws surrounding their firings.
So playing catch up on all of the court cases surrounding Trump's executive actions, at least 76 have been filed in federal courts so far. 30 are related to DOJ, or the administration's efforts to freeze funding. Zach, has the Trump administration seen any wins so far?
They have, but it has only been a few. So one particular win that comes to mind is Friday night, while everyone was out celebrating their Valentine's Day plans, we saw a judge issue a ruling in favor of the Trump administration, declining a request from a group of unions that would have sought to block Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency from gaining access to systems at the Labor Department, the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an agency that conservatives have really looked to gut under this new administration. So they did get that one win there, but what we've really seen over the last few weeks is a series of judges issuing, these nationwide injunctions blocking various aspects of the Trump administration agenda. Now, by some extent, this is by design. As we've been talking about, some of these cases really raise these questions of whether the Supreme Court is going to overturn decades-old precedents. So right now, so much of the action has been in the lower courts, and these lower judges don't have the authority to overturn Supreme Court precedent, of course. So I think a lot of people are just waiting to see once this gets to the nation's highest court, all these cases, that's where the real action will be.
The Hill's Zach Schonfeld, thanks so much for keeping us up to date on all of the legal drama surrounding the Trump administration so far. Good to see you.
Thanks, Julia.
At least 10 people have died, more than 1,000 rescued this weekend after a powerful storm battered much of the southeast with strong winds, heavy rain, and devastating flooding. And there's more to come. News Nation's Alex Capriello has the latest.
This is one of the most serious weather events we've dealt with in at least a decade.
Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear declaring a state of emergency after historic flooding sweeps across the state from a catastrophic storm over the weekend.
We are still in the search and rescue phase of this emergency.
Among the dead, a mother and her 7-year-old child killed when rushing floodwaters swept away their car near busy Interstate 65.
I've lived in this area my whole life, and this is the worst I've seen it in probably 30 years.
First responders carrying out more than 1,000 rescues of people trapped in rising waters. Kentucky now inundated with as much as 7 inches of rain, all causing rivers and creeks to overflow their banks. Officials there are urging residents to stay off roadways while giving life-threatening warnings about mudslides in the east and snow in the west.
If it gets to the point that they can't get out and the water's coming in, and we can't get to them, they need to get to higher ground the best they can.
For News Nation, I'm Alex Capriello.
News Nation's Alex Capriello, thank you. And that's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.